Somewhere, right now, someone is standing in their kitchen, jaw tight, one sentence away from saying something they already know they'll regret by tomorrow. Somewhere else, someone just heard the exact same kind of provocation and said nothing sharp at all, simply because they'd built, over years, the ability to feel the heat of the moment without needing to hand it a microphone. Both of them felt anger. Only one of them was ruled by it. This episode is about the narrow, half-second space between those two people, and how it gets built, one ordinary moment at a time, long before the provocation that finally tests it. The lie about anger. Here is the first mistaken belief worth clearing out of the way, because it causes real damage on its own. The idea that feeling angry in itself makes someone a bad, weak, or spiritually deficient person. Anger is not a moral failure. It is one of the most basic, universal human responses there is, as automatic and as involuntary as flinching from pain. Every person who has ever lived has felt it, including the calmest, most disciplined people anyone could name. The presence of anger says almost nothing about someone's character. What they do in the next several seconds says almost everything. What anger actually is. Strip away the shame usually attached to this emotion, and what remains is something closer to a signal than a sin. Anger tends to appear specifically when something feels violated, a boundary crossed, an unfairness witnessed, a value disrespected, a need ignored. Picture someone who feels a hot flash of anger when a coworker takes credit for their work. That anger isn't random or excessive. It's pointing directly at something real, a violation of fairness that deserves a response of some kind. The anger itself is simply the alarm going off. It is not, by itself, instructions for exactly what to do about it. Understood this way, anger becomes far less frightening. It is not an enemy to be eliminated. It is information, delivered urgently and sometimes uncomfortably about something that matters. The difference between feeling and acting. Here is the single most important distinction in this entire episode, and everything else discussed builds on top of it. There is a real difference between the feeling of anger and the action that follows it, and that gap, however brief, is the entire skill being discussed here. Picture someone insulted publicly in front of people whose opinion matters to them. In the space of roughly 1 second, several things become possible. A sharp comeback meant to wound, a controlled response given calmly, or simply silence. The anger itself doesn't choose which of these happens. A decision does. One made in a space so brief, it often feels like no decision was made at all. Strength, in this context, was never about not feeling the anger. It's about protecting that narrow space long enough for an actual choice to happen inside it, rather than skipping straight from provocation to reaction with nothing in between. Why suppressed anger doesn't disappear. It's worth addressing directly a mistake many well-intentioned people make in the opposite direction, believing that controlling anger means never feeling it, or forcing it down and pretending it isn't there. Picture someone who was taught, growing up, that expressing anger at all was unacceptable, so they learned to swallow it every time it appeared. Years later, this same person rarely raises their voice, and yet finds themselves chronically exhausted, prone to sudden, unexplained irritability over small things, or quietly resentful in ways they can't fully trace back to a specific cause. Suppressed anger does not vanish simply because it was never expressed. It tends to leak out sideways, as passive aggression, as physical tension, as sarcasm that lands harder than intended, as a slow accumulation of resentment toward people who were never told directly what the actual problem was. Genuine self-mastery over anger is not the same as pretending it doesn't exist. It's something else entirely. Why explosive anger feels justified and costs more than it seems. On the opposite end from suppression sits explosion. And it's worth being honest about why this option feels so satisfying in the moment, even though it rarely serves anyone well afterward. Picture someone who lets the sharp comeback fly, fully, without restraint. In that instant, it can feel powerful, like finally releasing pressure that had been building. But picture the same scene an hour later. The relationship now carrying new damage that didn't exist before. The other person defensive rather than reflective. And the actual issue that sparked the anger in the first place still completely unresolved, now buried under a fresh layer of hurt feelings on both sides. Explosive anger rarely fixes the original violation. It usually just adds a second problem on top of the first. And the momentary relief of letting it out tends to be followed by a much longer cost in repair, trust, and regret. The real strength, neither suppression nor explosion. If neither swallowing anger whole nor releasing it explosively actually works, what does? The answer sits in the uncomfortable middle most people skip past entirely. Feeling the anger completely, without minimizing it or pretending it isn't there, while still protecting that narrow space before responding. This is far harder than either extreme, because both suppression and explosion are, in their own way, escapes from having to sit inside the discomfort of feeling something intense without immediately doing something about it. Picture someone genuinely furious about a real injustice, who takes a full breath, feels the heat of it honestly, and only then decides how to respond. Sometimes still firmly, sometimes even sharply if the situation calls for it, but chosen rather than triggered. This is not emotional suppression, it's emotional command. The anger is fully felt and still, deliberately, put to use rather than allowed to run the moment on its own. Anger as information. What is it actually pointing to? Once the reflex to immediately act or immediately suppress is interrupted, even briefly, a useful question becomes available that almost never gets asked in the heat of the moment. What is this anger actually about? Picture someone who feels a disproportionate flash of anger at a minor comment from a partner. On the surface, the comment was small. Underneath it, the anger might be pointing at something larger and older. A pattern of feeling unappreciated that's been building for weeks, or an old wound from a previous relationship that this small comment accidentally brushed against. Anger addressed only at its surface trigger tends to recur endlessly because the actual source was never identified. Anger examined for what it's really pointing to, even just briefly, even imperfectly, starts to become genuinely useful information rather than simply an uncomfortable feeling to get rid of as quickly as possible. How unprocessed anger corrodes relationships. Left unaddressed over a long enough time, the pattern discussed in this episode doesn't stay contained to single incidents. It quietly reshapes entire relationships. Picture a household where anger is either constantly exploding or constantly suppressed, with no middle ground ever modeled. Over years, the people living inside that pattern often learn one of two things. Either that raising your voice is how you get taken seriously, or that expressing any negative feeling at all is dangerous and should be avoided completely. Neither lesson serves them well later in their own relationships, and both tend to repeat generation after generation until someone in the pattern deliberately interrupts it. The middle path discussed throughout this episode, feeling anger fully, responding deliberately, is not just personally healthier, it's often the only version of handling anger that doesn't quietly get passed down, unexamined, to whoever is watching and learning from how it's handled. The body keeps score before the words do. Anger rarely arrives instantly at full intensity. It builds physically in the body, and learning to notice these early physical signs is one of the most practical tools available for protecting that crucial space discussed earlier in this episode. Picture someone learning to notice, specifically, the first physical signs anger produces in their own body. A tightening jaw, a faster heartbeat, heat rising in the chest or face, a specific tone entering their own voice before a single, sharp word has actually been said. These signs almost always arrive before the point of no return, the moment where words, once said, can't be unsaid. A person who has trained themselves to notice these early signals has, in effect, bought themselves extra seconds of that crucial space discussed in Chapter 3. Time that simply isn't available to someone who only notices they're angry once they're already 3 sentences into saying something they'll regret. Practical ways to protect the pause. Understanding the importance of that narrow space intellectually is different from actually being able to create it under real pressure. Here are the specific, practical tools people actually use to widen that gap in the moment. Picture someone feeling the early physical signs of anger rising during a difficult conversation. Rather than speaking immediately, they take one slow breath before responding. A small physical act that reliably interrupts the automatic reflex from feeling straight into speaking. Others find it useful to name the feeling internally, even silently. I am angry right now, which, oddly, tends to reduce the emotion's grip simply by being acknowledged directly rather than acted out unconsciously. Still others physically remove themselves briefly from the situation. I need a few minutes before we keep talking about this. Buying real time rather than relying purely on willpower in the heat of the moment. None of these tools eliminate the anger. All of them widen the gap between feeling it and acting on it, which, as established throughout this episode, is the entire skill in question. When anger is righteous and when it's ego. It's worth making an honest distinction here, because not all anger deserves the same response, and pretending otherwise oversimplifies something genuinely complicated. Picture someone witnessing real cruelty or injustice done to someone else. This kind of anger is not something to suppress or apologize for. It's often an appropriate, even necessary response that can fuel real, constructive action on someone's behalf. This is different from anger triggered mainly by wounded ego, being contradicted, not being immediately agreed with, having one's authority mildly questioned. The practical test worth applying honestly in the moment: is this anger protecting someone vulnerable or defending an injustice? Or is it mainly protecting how I look, how right I need to be, how in control I need to appear? The first kind of anger, channeled deliberately rather than explosively, can be a genuine force for good. The second kind, examined honestly, usually deserves the pause described throughout this episode far more than it deserves the microphone. Repairing after losing control. No one manages this perfectly every time, and it's worth addressing directly what happens on the occasions the pause fails. because it will, eventually, for everyone. Picture someone who did explode, said something sharp they regret, and now has to face the aftermath. The instinct is often either to over-apologize repeatedly out of guilt, or to minimize what happened to avoid the discomfort of fully owning it. Neither serves the relationship well. What tends to work better is a direct, specific acknowledgement, naming exactly what was said, why it was wrong to say it that way, and what will be different next time, rather than a vague, general, sorry, that doesn't actually address the specific harm done. This matters because repair, done honestly, rebuilds trust in a way that pretending it didn't happen, or excessive self-flagellation, rarely accomplishes. A single loss of control, handled with real accountability afterward, damages a relationship far less than the same loss of control followed by defensiveness or avoidance.
What gets passed on, whether intentionally taught or simply absorbed by observation, the way anger gets handled in a household rarely stays contained to the people directly involved in any single argument. Picture a child watching a parent handle a genuinely frustrating situation, a difficult phone call, a stressful piece of news, with visible tension but no explosion, followed by a calm explanation once things have settled. This child has just received a real, embodied lesson about what strength under pressure actually looks like, more powerful than any lecture on the subject could ever be. The reverse is equally true. A household where explosions are normal, or where all difficult feelings are silently swallowed and never acknowledged, teaches its own lesson just as effectively. Usually, one that takes years of deliberate, conscious effort to unlearn later in adulthood. This is, in part, why the work discussed throughout this episode matters beyond the person doing it. Anger and self-respect. There is a final piece worth naming clearly. The ability to feel anger fully without being ruled by it is not only about protecting other people from an explosive reaction. It is also, quietly, a profound form of self-respect. Picture someone who has spent years reacting instantly to every provocation, and who slowly builds the capacity to pause instead. Over time, they develop a specific kind of quiet confidence, the knowledge that they cannot be easily provoked into behavior they'll regret, that their reactions are genuinely their own choice, rather than something anyone else can simply trigger on command. This is a form of freedom rarely discussed directly. A person who can be provoked and still choose their response has taken something valuable back from anyone who might otherwise be able to control them simply by knowing which buttons to press. The practice, not the moment. Like everything else explored throughout this series, this skill is never built in a single, dramatic act of self-control. It's built the same quiet way discipline, patience, forgiveness, and every other quality discussed in this series are built. Through small, repeated choices that rarely feel significant on their own. The single breath taken before responding. The early physical sign noticed and named instead of ignored. The honest question asked about what the anger is actually pointing to. The direct, specific repair offered after the pause inevitably fails sometimes, as it will for everyone. None of it produces perfect control immediately or ever completely. But it accumulates, quietly, into someone who can feel real anger, fully and honestly, without that anger being the one who decides what happens next. That is the space before the reaction. Not because the anger stops arriving, but because you'll have already trained yourself to meet it there, instead of being swept past it.